Hello, hello. To join you this morning, and again, for you making the time to come out. As we always like to do, I'm going to open us with prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for giving us the opportunity to be able to come to a venue, to have a free exchange of ideas, and to be respectful, truthful, and loving in the dialogue. Lord, we thank you again for the wonderful state and country that you've blessed us with. We know that it is our responsibility to be diligent in maintaining the liberty and the constitutionally protected freedoms that those who have sacrificed before us to allow us the free speech that we are able to exercise today, that it is our responsibility to continue that. Lord, we just ask that you bless this event and everybody that's come out and everybody that is watching online, whether we agree or disagree, because healthy conversation in the arena of ideas is the name of the game. In the name, power, and in the authority of Jesus Christ, amen.
So I join Senator Lucero in thanking you for being here today, and those of you who are watching online appreciate that as well. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? So we bill it as a town hall, and that's what it is, and we're doing it in the true town hall sense, where we're inviting you to come up to, where did we put the mic? Over there? Okay. To engage with us, ask us questions, tell us why you disagree with us, tell us why you do agree with us, ask us questions about what's going down at the legislature. And it was my hope that, and maybe we have some folks here who have vehement, sincere disagreements who want to engage in respectful, productive conversation about those disagreements. So the reason why that's important, I think we saw a month ago with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, who was doing this very thing, trying to engage with people with whom he disagreed, and was met with violence as a result. And that's not something that came out of nowhere. That's not something that's brand new. That is something that has festered in our culture with this increasing unwillingness to engage with people that you disagree with. And I noticed it the first time I ran in 2022, I believe it was, yes. 2022, the first time I ran for the Minnesota House of Representatives. During my campaign, you receive a lot of criticism from people when you put your name in the hat to run for public office. And most of it comes online, right? You see these messages, you see these comments of people who, I despise you for this, I think you're wrong about that. And I would reach out to those folks individually and their organizations. And I would say, let's sit down. Let's have a conversation. I'd be happy to talk to you. I'll do it publicly. I'll do it on your terms. You define the terms, when, where. You can tape it, you can broadcast it, you can live stream it, whatever you want to do. And nobody would take me up on it. In fact, I got messages back from some saying, well, we're not going to platform you. We're not going to spread your message by engaging with you. And when that's where you're at, where you're unwilling to even engage with the other side of an argument, it becomes dangerous. Because how then do you resolve those disagreements? That's the reason why, that's the structure of our government was put in place to resolve disagreements peacefully. It's the alternative to gang warfare. That is the alternative. And we're seeing little incidents of that peek through the surface. The Charlie Kirk situation is just one example. We've seen continuous violence before and since that's increasing in the American political life. And it's a detriment to people who might otherwise be willing to put their hat in the ring for public service. I can tell you for a fact, I'm aware of at least one person who was considering a run for statewide office, who doesn't currently hold office, doesn't currently live in political life, who decided after our colleague, Speaker Emeritus Melissa Hortman, was assassinated back in June, that was the end of that. Not going to put my family in that type of a situation. And that's a reality that those of us who are serving and who continue to serve, and people who put their hat in the ring to potentially become candidates for public office, that's a new reality that we have to deal with. And so what's the solution to that? The solution to that is this. It's to talk it out. It's to find out where are the fault lines and how do we navigate them. And to that end, I'll turn it back over to Senator Lucero to give you something that you might disagree with, right? Let's stir up the pot. And by the way, if you have questions ready to go, you can go ahead and step up to the mic, and we'll get to you shortly.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for those who have still come in. And here are some statements that I believe to be true, and I look forward, if anybody disagrees, to come up and let's have a conversation. Jesus Christ died, was buried, and rose again. I am a wretched sinner saved by grace, and Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. We are all created in the image of God. The source of liberty is the Creator, and liberty is granted to each individual. The purpose of human government is to secure the unalienable rights of every individual. We live in a republic, and we live in the greatest constitutional republic in human history. Life begins at conception. All life has value, and we have a moral obligation to protect innocent life from conception to natural death. Free market capitalism is the best economic system to achieve prosperity through efficiency and innovation. Healthcare is not a human right. Housing is not a human right. It is impossible to change one's sex. The most a person can do is mutilate themselves. A transvestite woman is not a real woman, but instead a man in make-believe mode. Tolerance is simply a term trying to glorify delusions. Firearms do not cause violence, but instead people perpetuate evil by using inanimate objects to harm others. Human activity is not changing the Earth's climate. Parents are the ultimate authority over their children's education. Medical freedom is superior to government coercion. And truth has no agenda. Truth simply needs people to defend it. So with that, again, we'd love to have questions.
So I'll start because there's some pretty provocative statements in there. Let's start with healthcare is not a human right. What do you mean by that, Senator Lucero? Because a lot of people say that nowadays.
Fantastic. Human rights at their most basic level do not require anything from anybody else. If we look at the First Amendment, for example, the freedom to peacefully assemble, it doesn't require anybody to pay for anything. It doesn't require anybody to give of anything. The freedom of speech, to speak out against the government, it doesn't require anybody to pay for anything. But when it comes to all these other liberties, a true civil liberty is one that doesn't require anything. When it comes to health care, it cannot be a human right. Health care is incredibly important, but it's not a right because providing health care, calling it a right, would then require somebody to have to pay for it. And in the extreme, it would require the confiscation of somebody's labor, a nurse, a doctor, the equipment that might be involved, the confiscation of that and the forceful administering of that skill set to somebody else. And in that basic definition, it therefore cannot be a right.
And the same applies to housing as well, right? Because in either case, what you're saying when you claim a right to a product or a service, what is the source of that product or that service? Well, it's the labor of another human being. Whether actually them laboring to do it or by taking their property in the form of taxes in order to provide for that product or service for someone else. And so there's a name for that, right? There's a name for forcing somebody else to labor on your behalf. And I think we know what the word is. And so if that's what you're advocating for, which you are when you claim that you have a right to a product, to a service, then you're advocating for putting somebody else under your thumb and forcing them to labor on your behalf, which is antithetical to the American project. Now, the follow-up question that would be is, well, by God, what are you saying? Are you saying that we should just let people lie in the street and have no housing and have no health care? By what means are people going to be taken care of, if not through the forceful labor of their fellow human beings? What do you think about that one?
Throughout human history, housing is important. Throughout human history, healthcare is important. Also throughout human history, there have been, in recognition of this, there have been non-government institutions, whether they be organizations, nonprofits, or individuals volunteering of their time and or establishing fundraising to then pay for the health care or the housing of others. It's happened throughout human history. It's happened across the world. And what, unfortunately, in our day, and we've had a close-up look at this, is that when government is involved and starts to allocate money to these areas, it has the impact of drying up the voluntary sources of charitable contributions from individuals and organizations. It has an adverse impact. As government spending in these areas increases, these other areas decrease. But unfortunately, when government is involved in this, they're not making decisions based on pure necessity. They're making decisions based on political calculus. And so when funding allocations come through committee or come through the legislature, again, there's that political calculus of favoritism for certain political demographics that skew the decision-making in these areas, in any area. But to answer the question, we absolutely, fundamentally believe that assisting people that are of lesser means in the areas of healthcare, housing, or anything else is critically important. It's just not a proper role and function of government.
Yeah, and again, don't be shy. If you want to ask a question, the mic's right there. You can go ahead and step up to it. To kind of flesh that out, what that actually looks like practically, because, we're expressing principles here, right? Philosophy doesn't really help unless you apply it to the real world. So we've seen massive, massive amounts of fraud in this state, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars. I think U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson recently said that it's approaching $2 billion, and there's probably significantly more. A few weeks ago, he had a press conference where he announced 8 new indictments related to the housing stabilization services. So what is that? What is housing stabilization services? Well, I'll explain it to you the way I explained it to my 12-year-old. What we do is we take these bags of cash, like in the cartoons when the robber robs the bank. We take these bags of cash and we just hand them over to people and we say, go help the homeless, Godspeed. And that's it. That's pretty much it. We don't really have any mechanisms for accountability to determine whether or not they're actually engaging in benevolent services, but we trust that they are. And amazingly, that has not worked out. Amazingly, as U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson pointed out during his press conference, the majority, he says, the majority of those bags of cash that we're handing over, and it's not just housing stabilization services, that's only one program. You, of course, remember Feeding Our Future. We've got services for autism services, tutoring services, medical transportation services. The list goes on. And they are all riddled with this fraud. Now, how is that possible? Well, it starts with healthcare as a human right. Housing is a human right. It starts with that fundamental core idea that because people have a right to these services, it's our obligation to provide them those services as a state. And so once you buy into that premise, it creates this demand for benevolence. And it appeals to your better natures, your better angels, of, oh, we're helping people. But are we? No. I mean, we're talking about, in some cases, a dozen fraudulent businesses housed in one building, all created for the unique purpose of defrauding the government. Like, all they do is set up their business and start billing the state. They're not helping a single person. They're signing up people who don't even know they've been signed up. They're signing people up who do know they've been signed up and then not helping them. We had a testifier come to I sit on the House Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Committee. We had a testifier come who was receiving housing services. And the way it worked was, if I remember correctly, is that he had some amount of his rent was reduced, and so the provider is taking a loss there on the rent. But they make up for it, and then some, by charging him, or charging the state, daily for providing him with services. Services like coming in to help him clean up his apartment, or services like making sure that he's able to go about his daily routine, or whatever the case may be. The only problem is, none of those services were actually being provided, but the state was being billed over $200 a day to provide them. You catch up on that diminished rent pretty quick, right? And then some. And that's what's happening, is that these fraudulent services in the name of benevolence are being offered with no accountability. And my favorite thing, I'd be curious to know if you've run in this too over in the Senate, is as the cost of this stuff, before the fraud became really, really apparent, we noticed the cost for sure. Like housing stabilization services, I believe the first year it was supposed to cost $2 million, and it ballooned to like 200 in the first year or something like that. And we noticed that, and we say, wow, that's something. You guys said this was going to cost $2 million, and it ended up costing 200. What's going on there? And you know what their answer was? Well, we just underestimated the need. Clearly, by virtue of the fact that this program costs 100 times more than we thought it was going to, that means there's 100 times much more need out there that needs to be met. You know what this actually means? It means we need to spend even more money on this program, because by God, there's probably much more need out there than we could possibly imagine. And so they just feed this feedback loop, again, appealing to your better angels, appealing to your benevolence, to try to guilt you into accepting the fact that they're taking your money. That's what lies at the heart of this, is that actual benevolence is a transaction where, yes, you're being generous to someone else, you're being charitable to someone else. You're not gaining materially from that transaction, but you are gaining spiritually. You're gaining relationally. That person who you're helping, that's a relationship that you just formed. And what does it foster? It fosters gratitude. Gratitude which can inspire people to change their lives so that they no longer require that charity, that generosity, that benevolence. What the state has done is it's taken that relationship out of the picture and inserted itself as the mediator that is not acting benevolently, clearly, right? Because one thing you wouldn't do if you were going to help somebody out is just hand them cash and never follow up with what are you doing with that? How has your life been made better? How can we get you to where you need to be? How can we get you from point A to point B to where you're living a productive life? But that's the way the state functions. And so that leads to the question of, what do we do about it in policy? How do we change this? Do we just eliminate state benevolence altogether? Or do we change systematically how we do it? One thought I have, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, Eric, is put the incentive structure back in place where whoever's providing these services actually has to be accountable to the person who's receiving them. We call that the market, right? So if we're going to help somebody out, we help that person out, having established their eligibility to be helped, and then they decide who they're going to engage with, who's actually going to provide them with that service. And I think if we just implemented that principle, we would immediately save hundreds of millions of dollars.
think of all the areas in our life where we are asking for money. It could be in the context of an auto loan or a mortgage. We have to go to an entity, we have to fill out an application, and then we have to meet a series of criteria, and then we are held accountable. Or it could be within business. You could be a manager or director in any department in business, and on an annual basis, the manager or the director of the department will have to put together a presentation for the next superior person in that organization to justify the staff, the head count, and or any additional equipment that might be needed based on whatever's happening in that department. And they have to justify. They're accountable. So in any other area of our life where we're looking for money, accountability, responsibility is there. But when it comes to government, that is the number one reason why we are seeing these vast amounts of fraud, because of the absence of accountability and transparency. It reminds me of an old adage that I heard when I was elected to the legislature. If you want more of something, that something, just fill in the blank. If you want more of a certain behavior, subsidize it in government now. If you want less of a certain behavior, tax it. Taxing acts as a disincentive to engage in a certain behavior. Often cited is the sin tax. Raise the taxes on alcohol and cigarettes because it'll act as a disincentive for somebody to engage in that behavior. Well, if that's true, and that is true, then taxing anything else has the same impact. Raising the income tax results in a disincentive for people to engage to the fullest extent, the fullest amount of effort of working, because at some point it has the law of diminishing returns. Similarly then, on the other hand, if you want more of a behavior, subsidize it. And so when we saw $2 million, a balloon to $200 million or whatever it was, if you want more of a behavior, subsidize it. So with that, I see somebody at the microphone.
Yes, hi. My name is Allison. I live in the area. I've been in the medical profession for over 25 years, and since 2007 to 2012, there's been a lot of major changes in medical that I believe created the opportunity for this fraud that is happening. But my question has to do with, have you looked into other states that are able to function well with the healthcare issues that go on in the states?
Well, one thing I'll say is that it's hard to compare other states to Minnesota because nobody does what we do. Okay?
That is true.
Nobody does what we do. We are the state in the union that has this level of fraud, these types of programs with this amount of lack of accountability. So we could look at probably any other state to see how they do it and implement their methodology and immediately be doing significantly better than we currently are. If your measure of success is where the rubber meets the road, people actually getting helped, right? People who actually need it, getting it, and the money being spent, appropriated, and spent in the manner that it was intended legislatively. If that's your measure of success, we would immediately be significantly more successful the next day after we implemented what literally any other state is doing. But going back to the argument that we have in our committees and on the House floor, the Senate floor, I don't think that's the measure of success from the current regime, and certainly under the Democrat trifecta in the last couple of years. Their measure of success seemed to be finding more ways to spend money, finding more need, discovering, going forth and exploring and discovering all the need that needs to be fulfilled. And so to them, success is the more we spend, the better we're doing.
Well, that's kind of what I see, and I have a sister-in-law that is, handicapped. She's has no use of her arms, legs. She's in a wheelchair. And she doesn't get the assistance that apparently a lot of people do get. She's not in the Twin Cities. She's in rural area up north. And so is there any way, so like our family basically takes care of her. I mean, there's not really any other options. And so is there any way, I know that in the government wants to just take on these responsibilities, but that's really just making us take the responsibility for it other than individuals. So is there a way that we can take that off the government responsibility? I mean, like, I don't want to say just cut people off, but a way to ensure that people that need it are getting it, as opposed to people that are just saying they need it.
Government, the tendency of government is to grow over time. And that's exactly what's happened in the state of Minnesota and across the country, but I'll just say the state of Minnesota, it continues to grow. And the way that I think of it is, think of, for those who have ever made a loaf of bread. You're going to make the dough, and you have to allow it to rise. And then what do you have to do after it rises? Before you bake it, you have to knead it, right? And why are you kneading it? You're working out the inefficiencies that form, the corruption within the entity or this dough, the loaf of bread. You work out the inefficiencies that have formed to shrink it, to get it more pure in its form before you bake it. Government is the same thing. It continues to grow and grow and grow, and it has these inefficiencies. When it comes to paying for these services, which are very much the people or the person you're describing, they have a need, a genuine need, and they need assistance. And as government has grown over time, it has consumed more and more of the family budget, more and more of individuals' budget. And that because more is being paid to government, there's less money available in the individual and family budget in order to pay for such services on their own in the private sector. And that's the conversation that is rarely spoken of, is the only entity that can solve or pay for these is the government. Whereas if we shrunk the amount of money that is in the government coffers, they're leaving the money, more money in the individual and family budgets, allowing them, empowering them to make the decisions for those in their spheres to care for them. And I'll say one more thing, just generically then on the healthcare system. It is broken. I think everybody recognizes that across the aisle. We can no longer continue to tinker on the edges. And year after year, I don't have a healthcare background. I don't sit on any of the Health and Human Services committees. But even those who do not have a healthcare background or sit on committees like in a similar position to myself, we can all recognize the pain that's broken. The system is broken from top to bottom, from pharmaceuticals to providers to insurance companies, the entire continuum of the healthcare system. What is recognizable is most in this room lived in the era of pre-Obamacare. Most in this room, I just had this conversation earlier this week with another constituent. Most in this room lived in the era before deductibles. Do you remember the time even before copays? I remember, it was either late 80s or early 90s, when the advent of the copay came into existence. And even then, I think it was $5. A $5 copay. Now, what is the copay? I think for me, it's $35, and it's probably $50 or more for many people. And so there are many that are living today in the post-Obama era that they know nothing else than skyrocketing premiums, skyrocketing deductibles, skyrocketing copays, and the lack of quality in many cases in the delivery of the healthcare services. And so I'm of the position that we can no longer continue to tinker on the edges We have to fundamentally reform. We need to get back to a time when family practices were actually able to exist, where the free market forces, the competitive forces, drove high quality and drove down costs. But unfortunately, the conglomerate of the pharmaceutical company, the healthcare, insurance companies, and others have gotten us to where we are today, and Obamacare exponentially made it worse. Exponentially made it worse. So anyway, just some generic comments on the healthcare.
I can also make some comments on healthcare, being in it for many years. Between 2009 and 2012, 13 maybe, there was a change from ICD-9 to ICD-10, which is the billing factor for Medicare, Medicaid, insurance, that type of stuff, and that probably had something to do with Obamacare as well, which then made private physicians unable to practice without the assistance of somebody else because the rules were so difficult to understand for the changes of how to charge somebody. With that being said, is there, basically what happened is they businessified the medical profession. So prior to that, in the state of Minnesota had much lower premiums, had much better care, although in other states they didn't have that. But in Minnesota, we were doing much better prior to that on a general population. So when that happened and we moved to the ICD-10, then that totally businessified, and then the pharmaceutical companies comes down to the providers and says, hey, you have to do this before you do this, before you do this, and then you give them this drug. And this drug will make them take this drug, and this drug will make them take this drug. And me, myself, being in the medical profession for 25 years, don't go to the doctor. I don't go to the doctor because I don't want to hear them tell me something. Or when I do go to the doctor, I go to them and I say, hey, I have this going on, and I want you to do this. And I know that general population people that don't have medical backgrounds cannot go to the doctor and say, hey, this is what's going on, this is what I think it is, and I want you to do this, and no, I'm not going to do an X-ray, MRI, CAT scan before I do it.
I love what you said about the businessification of the healthcare industry. There are phenomenal individuals within the healthcare system. There are people, nurses, doctors, many different individuals across the medical spectrum. They are pouring their hearts into the care of their patients. And they're getting up every day. They're making sacrifices. They're working hard under very stressful conditions. Phenomenal individuals. And I'm making a distinction between not them, but it's the system. The businessification, as you said. And that's the challenge that needs to be reformed. With that, we thank you for coming up. There is somebody behind you, so thank you.
My name's Jennifer, and good afternoon for good morning for having this forum. So I was listening to U.S. Attorney Joe, interim U.S. Attorney, the other day, and he brought up a really great point that I kind of am interested in what your thoughts are. So a forensic auditor actually got him to look into all of the Feeding Our Future stuff because initially it didn't look like there was a case. And then that person brought up and said, no, actually, here's all the information you needed. And as they dug into all the cases, they kind of realized that there were lots of people who worked in the administration, lower-level employees that knew things were going on. But it's very difficult for someone making a basic average wage to speak up because of the economic consequences to them. If they speak something up, the powers that be, impacts their ability to earn a living, and people have their own bills to pay and they don't want to speak up. And I don't think that it's just in one department. It's in the Department of Education, in the Department of Health. In fact, the Department of Labor just the other day sent out an open solicitation for $750,000 grants for mental health services for people in the construction industry with zero accountability in any of those programs. So you can imagine, for infinite amounts of millions of dollars that are going to go out of the door in the Department of Labor. And I'm happy to send that to you because I was surprised. It was an open email. So is there any talk of legislation, or what is the current stuff on whistleblower protections for employees that work in not just the Department of Ed, the Department of Health, the Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, all of them, where if they speak up and if it's shown to be a reasonable alert, red flag in the system, that their livelihood or their ability to earn a living isn't retaliated or impacted, and how can we beef up that, because they're the ones on the closest to the ground who could see that. So is there any talk of legislation coming through, things or thoughts you may have that you're like, oh, maybe we might try to percolate that, or any thoughts on that in particular? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I am aware of the fact that in this last session we did pass something along the lines of whistleblower protections. I can't recall the specific provisions and exactly what level of protection they provide. What I'll say is that even if you have such a law, people respond to their culture, right? And there is a culture that has been cultivated in these state agencies to downplay the fraud. Now, that might be changing simply because out of the shame, at the political shame and the political necessity to do something about it. But again, sitting on the House Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Committee, we have been privy to many, many anecdotes, many, many whistleblower reports, many, many claims from folks who work in these agencies or adjacent to them that report retaliation, report the signals being sent in subtle or overt ways that we don't want you looking into this, we don't want you doing anything about it. And so as long as that's the culture that people are operating in, even if you provide them with legal protection that assures them that they won't have to face any sort of consequence for doing their due diligence, they're still going to have to meet with the fact that when they go to work the next day, they're going to be a pariah, right? Like, even if they don't get actively retaliated against, they don't get terminated, they don't face some sort of disciplinary consequence, they know that they're going to be the black sheep the next day they show up to work. And so what really needs to happen is that the culture needs to be changed. And I don't see how that culture is going to be changed under this administration, because it's the people at the top who have created that culture. The only way to change it is to change out those people. So I'll leave it there.
You know, to further the idea of the culture, and Representative Hudson is spot on. To further the idea of the current culture under the current administration, Governor Walz, in all of the fraud that has occurred during his tenure, coming up on 8 years, not a single person has been terminated or disciplined. They've been shuffled around except for one. And the one individual that was terminated was just done so recently, and it was done, I think it was the day before they were to testify before the committee. The day before that individual was going to come and testify in front of the House Fraud Committee is the only termination I'm aware of. So think of all the actions that have happened. All the fraud. That's the only individual. And then, again, just because I don't believe it's a coincidence, they were going to come before the committee and testify. That sets a tone. That sets a culture. It empowers people to continue the flagrant disregard and lack of accountability that we see in many of our state agencies.
Looks like we got another question.
Excuse me. I follow Kyle Seraphin. He's a FBI whistleblower. And so he's got a podcast, and he will let you know that whistleblowers are not what there is no protection for whistleblowers, but that's not my real. I saw recently that, I don't know if it's Steve Simons, but somebody's trying to pass some legislation for how we vote in Minnesota. Are you familiar with that?
Are you referring to ranked choice voting?
Something like that. Yes, I just post about it, which I guess when I first saw you on a video, excuse me, you were explaining why the Somali community is taught how to have nonprofits so that they can get all these millions of fraudulent dollars and fund the Democrat elections. And I thought you did a really great job. And so what my question is, our government, Minnesota is run by criminals, and it's because of voter fraud. And what did you call it, free elections? Is that what they're calling it?
Ranked choice voting is what I
ranked
thought you were
choice.
talking about.
In the 2026 elections, who is going to monitor the polling places?
Well, that's a good question. So we have election judges, we have poll watchers, and actually this past session, believe it or not, this was the first time in a very long time that we actually passed election laws that made elections better. Didn't make them awesome, didn't clean up everything, but it certainly addressed certain key issues that emerged during the 2024 election cycle. For instance, you may recall there was a story about how, I believe it was Hennepin County, was not ensuring party balance in these rules. I can't remember if it was election judges or poll watchers or both, but you're supposed to have an equal number of people representing both major parties. Makes sense, right? You want to make sure there's fairness. Anytime we have like a convention and a political party and you're deciding an endorsement contest, a representative from each candidate goes back and watches the count. Makes sense, right? Want to have integrity in the process. Well, Hennepin County, as I recall from this story, was just flagrantly not abiding by that. And so that was addressed in election law that was passed this last session, believe it or not. And also, there were some changes made to try to ensure that what happened down in Shakopee with the 21 missing ballots that just were never found or accounted for, and then instead of having another election, a judge decided, well, you know, we can just violate the anonymity of secret ballots and have people come into open court and tell us who they voted for, and we're going to figure out the election that way. Okay, that's the way they did it. So we did something to address that as well. So things will be better in 26. It's still going to require a great deal of vigilance. And so what I would suggest is get involved, sign up to be an election judge, sign up to be a poll watcher. There are tons of folks out there who specialize in organizing that. I'm not one of them, but you can find them pretty easily with a simple Google search.
When you say sign up, you're saying do a Google search of where to sign up, or
yeah, to be an election judge. In fact, you could probably talk to that guy standing right behind you there. He could hook you up with with information on how to become an election judge or a poll watcher.
I just wanted years ago when I was involved in I was an alternate at the Republican convention, and that's where I saw that Hennepin County had the highest population, in Minnesota, and then there's, St. Paul. So you don't have to have voter fraud in the whole state. You just have to have voter fraud, like you say, in Hennepin County, and you can win an election.
I would say that is conceptually true, but I would caution you and caution all of you from therefore assuming that we don't have issues with fraud all across the state. Because that's the thing. I think sometimes people assume, oh, this is a Hennepin and Ramsey problem, and that's where it's all centered. I would argue it's probably concentrated there, but especially, these elections are statewide, right? So
I've lived in Stearns County and, in a township, and, it's pretty hard to, if you've got 300 people voting, it's pretty hard to have a large voter fraud. But like in Hennepin County, and then I've lived in North Minneapolis, and I just wanted to see what a Democrat precinct caucus was like. And when you talk about risking your life, if I were to go to the Cedar Riverside district and try to monitor or be an election judge in the Cedar Riverside polling place, I probably could die there. I mean, I'm just saying these people are dangerous. So I will talk to somebody about being an election judge. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And since you brought it up, I do want to talk a little bit about the Somali community and the impact that this cynical approach to politics has had upon them as a community. Because I worked very briefly for the Republican Party of Minnesota doing community outreach, and as part of that work, I engaged quite a bit with the Somali community, met a lot of their leaders, sat down and had dinner in Somali restaurants, drank Somali tea, which is actually really good if you ever get the chance to have Somali tea, very sweet. And I was kind of amazed at what I heard from them. Like, I sat down with a group of Somali leaders near Cedar Riverside in a restaurant, and without me, just introductions, right? That's as far as we got, is this is who I am, this is who you are. Without me saying a word, they just opened up with all the things that they are dealing with in their community. And you know what it was? You know what they said their top priorities were? Number one, school choice. Their top concern was the ability to transmit our culture and values to our kids without these mandates that we teach these things that go against our fundamental values and our religious beliefs. That was their top issue. Second, public safety. Can you believe it? In Minneapolis, in Defund the Police Minneapolis, here I am talking to Somali community leaders, and they're saying, we want more cops. We're not against the police. And they told this story, and I might be getting the details wrong. I apologize if I am. There was apparently a 20-something-year-old young man who, in despair, leapt out of a window of one of those Cedar Riverside towers, about 20 stories up. The result of that was a 3-hour wait for emergency services to show up, during which children are walking by the scene. The mother is down there, distraught, having to be comforted, finding no comfort. And the reason they told me that story is they said, this is unacceptable. And the reason why it's happening is because the police, they're going to respond to scenes that they can do something about before they respond to a scene that they can't do something about, right? If there's an active situation going on somewhere, that's going to take precedence over a situation where, tragic though it is, a police presence isn't going to prevent further harm. It's the same thing with EMS, right? Got to go to the person we can save before we go to the person we can't save. But 3 hours? That indicates a lack of resources. And so that was their second thing, public safety. We want public safety. They talked about economic freedom. We want to just run our businesses. Can we please just run our businesses? I mean, these are the type of issues that they were talking about. And so you might wonder, well, gee, you want Republicans then, right? Like, that's what you're asking for. You want school choice, public safety, economic freedom, religious freedom. Which side's going to give you that? So why are you voting for the folks who are never going to provide you with any of that? And the answer is, as was hinted, as was pointed out, is that it's basically a two-pronged approach. Number one, they were the first ones to get there, the Democrats. They were the first ones to get there, and they got in their ear, and they pumped their ears full of Republicans hate you, Republicans want to deport you, Republicans think you're evil and bad, and they're Islamophobic, and this, that, and the other thing. So they turn them against us that way, to where we're your only option, we're your only safe option. So come vote for us. That's number one. Number two, I believe, this is my personal belief, based upon everything I've been privy to, both officially and unofficially, is they set up these mechanisms to make people rich. The nonprofits, the private businesses, the grant recipients, and you put people in key positions of influence within the community. You set them up to get rich in this way, and then they're going to use their influence within the community to make sure that their people vote the way their patrons want them to vote. That's what's going on. So the lesson from there is twofold. One, we should probably do something about that electorally. And number two, in order to be successful in doing something about it electorally, we have to start making a distinction between those who've engaged in the bad actions and those who recognize that their community has been exploited by political cynicism.
Good morning. I want to make sure that I can ask this properly. When I was a kid, my grandma used to talk a lot about World War II, and she talked about people in Hollywood being blackballed, just protecting our country against communism. And recently I watched a documentary that's going around, I think it's called The Precarious State, about Minnesota. And it had a nice lineup of video footage of people that are involved in Hennepin County that are self-proclaimed Marxists. And in the last election, when it took place, I think a lot of us had hope that we were going to see a cleaning house across the nation. I'm just wondering, what is the current, how do we handle treason in this country? I thought that it was like you die by hanging or something. Like, how come all of this, how come we're just using legislation to try to handle this problem where we really need to actually physically remove people and guard our republic? Because I think we're at risk of losing it, seriously, you know?
Well, I think you're right in terms of returning to enforcing the law, returning to tough on crime. I like the phrase making crime illegal again. Let me first address your question, your comment about cleaning house. So I'll use a picture here. People don't grow fat like myself. You just wake up one day and you are fat. And I look in the mirror and I'm disappointed with myself, right? And the question I have to ask myself in that moment is, well, how did I get here? I'm not happy with myself, with what I've become. I demand immediate rollback and results the other direction, right? Well, that's not reality. Because the reality is, I got there with one spoon of chocolate ice cream at a time for many weeks, months, and years, and pieces of chocolate cake, and Tres Leches is one of my favorites, by the way, cake over time, and I get to where I am. So it took me months and years to get to a point of disappointment. I can't have an expectation that I'm going to roll it back immediately. Instead, it's going to take a similar amount of time to go backwards for transformation and rolling back. Similarly then with government, in that we've gotten to a point here over many, many years and decades of lack of accountability. One of the most shocking, just one of the most recent shocking, but there's a long list of abuses, the weaponization of government. One of the most recent shocking ones was the spying on 8 Republican U.S. senators, for those who saw that headline, by the federal government. I think it was the FBI, if I remember correctly. And so this abuse, this weaponization of government, lawfare as it's called, is definitely a threat to a free society. Well, how do we roll it back? What do we do? President Trump, there certainly is a lot of work to be done to root out these actors that have no hesitation to abuse government power to harm people they perceive to have a political difference. And it's good. It can't happen overnight, but he is working on it. That much we can see in these institutions. In terms of accountability, yeah, we need to have greater accountability. There needs to be a healthy fear of accountability. When you see things like people being given the death penalty, but they're not executed until 25 years later, that doesn't act as a disincentive because justice isn't swift and sure. And so we have to we need to have a greater surety of punishment for those that seek to weaponize government and go after their perceived adversaries.
So a big part of the reason why we're here today, why we decided to put on this event, is because we recognize that the conversation is important, discussion is important, deliberation is important. That's how we solve our problems. That's how we arrive at what our public policy is going to be. But a prerequisite to that is order. You have to have order before you can have a conversation, which is exactly why all this talk about turning down the temperature and bringing down the rhetoric is the wrong conversation to be having right now. Because what we lack, what's necessary for that, is order, first and foremost. And the juxtaposition that demonstrates this is, again, back in June, we had the tragic assassination of our colleague, Speaker Maritime Melissa Hortman, her husband, the shooting of your colleague, Senator Hoffman, and his wife. And in the aftermath of that, for weeks, if not months, there was this conversation that we were having about turning down the temperature, toning down the rhetoric. How are we going to kumbaya? How are we going to come together and be productive and peacefully move forward? And a lot of us were part of that conversation. I myself was on plenty of interviews, TV, radio, podcasts, with legacy mainstream people having that conversation. Places like TPT Almanac, right? None of that was happening after Charlie Kirk's assassination. All that talk just went away about how are we going to turn down the temperature. In fact, within moments, certainly hours, of Charlie Kirk being assassinated brutally, people were doubling down on the fascist rhetoric and the Nazi rhetoric. And what that demonstrated, and when I say people, I'm not just talking about people online, I'm not just talking about folks on Twitter, I'm talking about Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, Governor Tim Walz, former President Barack Obama, at least a dozen of my own legislative colleagues coming out making reprehensible statements in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk being assassinated. Now, in that context, that demonstrates that we have a disordered discourse. I can't have a conversation with you knowing that you want me dead. That's a non-starter. I think that's pretty reasonable, right? If we're going to sit down and talk, one thing that we shouldn't even have to have a conversation about is, by the way, just in case, are you planning to kill me? Or if somebody else did, would you get up and clap the moment it happened? Like, if those are the terms of debate, then there is no debate. So why do I even bring that up in response to your question? Because that concept applies more broadly, systemically, to our entire society right now. We have a society where the two sides, broadly speaking, are not seeking the same goals. They're just not. There are those of us who want to perpetuate the American project, to bequeath it to our children, to uphold the Constitution, to uphold individual rights, to maintain liberty. And there are those on the other side, and it's not all of them, trust me, there are Democrats in St. Paul who, off the record, will let me know how crazy they think some of their colleagues are. But it's the controlling interest on that side that has subscribed to this Democrat Socialist of America. We have to dismantle the United States. We have to break down the institutions. We have to liberate everybody from things like the family, right? That tension is irreconcilable. It's completely irreconcilable, and it's disordered. So, I think that what President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance have been saying, that it is time, once and for all, to defund, dismantle, and prosecute, in some cases, these explicitly violent, in many cases, but also just like people who are organizing to effect the dismantling of our institutions. You called it treason. I don't know that I would contest that. Really? You're under the laws of our country, you're organizing to end our country? Okay. I think that might color outside the lines of the freedom of association, right? That might color outside the lines of the freedom of speech. It's one thing for you to express the opinion that the United States shouldn't be a thing, or to express the opinion that our institutions should be dismantled. It's another thing to materially organize to affect it. And the example that I point back to is the mafia, organized crime. Organized crime in this country was a scourge, it still is, just in different forms, but it was a scourge on our streets for decades and decades and decades. And the way they were able to get away with it is by taking advantage of the liberties that are provided in this country. They used the Constitution as a shield. They adulterated it to enable them to engage in organized criminal activity. And the way it would work is you would have, for instance, the boss here and the henchman here, and the boss says to the henchman, I think it's time for Bob to take a vacation. Now, we both know what he didn't explicitly say. I go out and I act on it, and then I get caught, and then they come talk to him, and he says, whoa, I didn't say anything. I didn't tell him to go do that. Right? He did that on his own. I'm completely insulated. So how did we handle that? Well, we changed the law. We came up with something called RICO, Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organizations Act, or something like that. And what it said was, if we can demonstrate that people are in a formal or informal organization, and one of them is engaged in a crime, everybody involved in that conspiracy is going to face the same accountability as the person who actually pulled the trigger. That same concept needs to be applied today, immediately, against all of these organizations that are materially working to destroy our country. Certainly if they're employing violence or otherwise breaking the law in order to do it. Recall, did anybody remember Minneapolis burning down? Okay. That seem organic to you? All of a sudden there's people being bussed in from Chicago. Who paid for that? How did those pallets of bricks end up on the side of the corners? Just in case, just sitting there, right? Where'd they get all of the material to do what they did? Who was bringing them pizza? These are questions that should properly be answered, and the people who did it should be held as accountable as the actual people who committed arson, committed assault, whatever, the highest crimes that were committed. I mean, we had a 3rd precinct burned down, right? That accountability should go all the way up to the top of whoever it was that was providing that funding, and you trace those dollars all the way, and you're going to find some very powerful and influential people who need to face that accountability. It looks like we got another question.
Speaking of accountability, it's that time of the year where, everyone's talking about property taxes, and it seems like, I could be wrong, I'm young, but it does seem like overall in general, property taxes are kind of getting out of control. I am aware that back in the 90s there was a state law limiting on how much a levy could go up. My question is there any way to implement that back in the state? I know other states have it where, if it goes up 1% or 2%, it goes on the ballot so the residents, the people, can vote on it. So I'm just wondering if that's, something, a possibility, just throwing it out there.
So I'll just get this in quick. Our seatmate, so he's Senate District 30, I'm 30A. 30B is Paul Novotny up in the Elk River area. And he's working on that. He's been working on that last session. He wants to see that come back. I agree with him. He's being aided in developing the proposal by one of the county commissioners up there. So it is something that we're looking at. You're going to get a lot of pushback from the counties and a lot of pushback from the cities. And here's the thing is I don't begrudge them their pushback, because here's the tension that they're dealing with. You're mad at your city council, you're mad at your county commission for raising taxes. Well, guess what? They don't have a choice. Why? Because of what we're doing down in St. Paul. Continually telling them what they must do. Continually telling them you have mandating this service and that service, and you got to do things this way or that way. By the way, we know this is going to cost money, but we're not going to give it to you. So you just figure it out. And what that translates to is them having to raise your taxes. And then the political beauty of that is that the folks down in St. Paul get to pat themselves on the back and say, aren't we amazing? Look at how we're helping everyone by forcing the counties to do this, that, and the other thing. Meanwhile, the accountability, the political pushback, comes from you, the resident, going to your county commission and pounding the table and saying, why are you doing this to me? That's the dynamic. So I say that as a former city council member, and you were a former city council member, because I have a lot of sympathy for these folks, some of whom are in the room, who are either in those county or city positions, because it's the same thing we've done to our school boards. We elect people to the school board, but they don't actually get to decide anything, because it's all mandated from St. Paul. So the fix does need to happen legislatively.
So earlier this week, a senator, one of my colleague senators, brought up a point that I thought was interesting to chew on. And it was something along the lines of, and again, it's not fully mature or just an idea to put on the table to discuss, but his idea was a bill that would say mandates not funded are deemed unenforceable. I thought, okay, that's interesting. If the state puts a mandate on school districts or counties but doesn't have any funding along with them, they are rendered unenforceable. Something to chew on and think about. To property taxes. Something that has really bothered me for many years, and I know it's bothered probably everybody in this room and many people online, and that is those who own private property, whether you have a mortgage or you own it free and clear. If you stop paying your property taxes, eventually the government will take your property and liquidate it to pay for the taxes and then to give you the difference. That is unbelievably immoral. Because under such a system, you never really own your homestead. You never really own your real property in the truest sense of the word. Because you're always at threat then of government taking it. And so the property tax is ongoing. It's not like the sales tax where you buy an item, you pay the sales tax, and it's done. But when it comes to real property, it is in perpetuity. It's forever. Now, what are the property taxes funding? The percentages will be different, but roughly a third of it is funding the local municipality, whether it's a city or a township. Roughly a third is funding the school district of the area, and then roughly a third is funding the county government. Those entities need to be funded. So that's not in dispute. We need to fund local municipalities. They have staff. They have there might be law enforcement, or they're contracting out with law enforcement, fire services. There are needs. There's sewer water infrastructure needs. There is maintenance, parks, right? That has to be funded. So a tax is needed. Same thing with a county. There are services that are a necessity, and then same thing, obviously, with the school district. But there are conversations happening on what is the alternative, and there are many variations. There are many different states, so maybe one variation is to limit how much it can increase as a percentage. Another variation of the conversation is eliminating the tax with those that are seniors. There's all kinds of variations. One interesting, I think it was either last night or this morning that I heard, it was Governor DeSantis of Florida talking. And I don't think he actually said this, but it drew the idea in my mind is to eliminate, if we can't eliminate all property tax, at least eliminate property tax on residential properties. So those properties that are not in the business of generating revenue. So perhaps if we had to go somewhere, a starting point would be leaving the property tax on commercial properties, those that are generating revenue, eliminating it on residential properties. So whether it be single-family homes or apartment buildings, which are technically commercial properties, but they service as residential properties. But I thought that was an interesting idea. And it's one, I'm in favor of getting rid of the property tax because it's immoral. But at the same time, these government services need to be funded, and I'm open to any ideas, any model that would allow for that to happen, because I just cannot stand the idea that somebody's property can be confiscated by government and liquidated, even if they own it free and clear.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. The problem, again, is you've got this tension between, we love to talk about cutting taxes, because that's our party position, our ideological position, but the responsibility that we don't often successfully pair with that is you need to cut spending too, right? Because if all you do is cut the taxes and you don't cut the spending, then you're going to be in deficit, which we can't be constitutionally in the state of Minnesota for very long. And so we need to look at what are we spending money on? And we need to make choices, and we need to set priorities. You know, what should the priorities be? Well, our Constitution says we're going to have a uniform system of public education, so that stays. Public safety is obviously a priority. That's the primary reason, public safety and the judiciary, servicing justice, primary reason why government exists, so we got to have those. Transportation, we've got to maintain our infrastructure, a few other things. That's pretty much it. Like, that should be the core. And if we cut it down to just that, boy, I think we'd have all kinds of opportunities to cut taxes left and right. But you got to foster the political will in order to make that happen. So I did notice one question online, and we wanted to get folks who disagree with us to engage, and apparently commenting online is the methodology through which that's going to happen. So here's a question for you, Senator Lucero. Why do Republicans support a convicted sexual predator president?
Well, the first is he was convicted in civil court, is my understanding. Now, to be honest, I haven't followed all of the details. I know that there are some, so let me put this out there. I don't have a TV. I do not, I'm often accused of, Eric, you just watch Fox News and you're just repeating Fox News and blah, blah, blah. I don't even have cable television, and I don't have broadcast television. I have no idea what they're saying. I have no idea. So I'm not influenced by what's being said there. I do know that there's a lot of commentary out there, so I haven't followed that case, to be honest, so I can't speak to the specifics. But my understanding is that it was a civil. I think it goes back to what we spoke about of the weaponization of government. From what I do understand, there were those going after him that made part of their campaign, the district attorney or the attorney general or other prosecutors, they campaigned on a platform of going after President Trump. Well, how do you, if you are not in office and you're running for office and you are campaigning, if you're running for office, not in office, you don't have all of any evidence, right? You're not in a position of authority to know what the evidence might be because you don't have any mechanisms available to you other than what's in the public sphere. So if you're campaigning on prosecuting somebody as a promise, that in and of itself should be red flags. So from what I know of the details, it was a persecution, politically motivated, and in a lopsided area, and the conviction is a civil conviction, again, is my understanding. So why do Republicans? I don't support the man. I don't support any person, to be honest. I support ideas. And the ideas, whether it be President Trump, Representative Hudson, or anybody else, is what I'm looking for. Because if you follow a person, they may make the wrong decision, you'll be led astray. So I'm not allegiant to a person, I'm allegiant to ideas. The ideas that President Trump has promoted are absolutely necessary for turning this country around. That's why I did support him, and I continue to support him.
I have a little bit of an advantage on this question simply because I saw it long before I offered it. So you got the hot seat over there with answering that one. My understanding is that, as you stated, we're talking about a civil case, right? So I don't even think conviction is the right word to use because conviction applies to a criminal court. He never faced criminal charges.
If I could just butt in, so the threshold for a conviction in a civil matter is a preponderance of the evidence. It's 50% plus one, essentially. The conviction for a criminal matter, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. The threshold is much, much higher.
Right. And so my understanding is that, as you pointed out, this was politically motivated. We've seen this before. In New York, they put together, they invented an entire new legal theory to create felony charges against President Trump, piecing together a bunch of things that were misdemeanors that it's even questionable whether or not those things happened, the things that he was charged for misdemeanor. So, clearly, and this is why all this talk right now of, oh my Lord, Trump is using the mechanisms of government to go after his political enemies. I'm sorry, were you asleep the past 4 years? Did you not notice all of the lawfare that was directed against him specifically, but also the rest of us? I'm old enough to remember under Barack Obama when Attorney General Eric Holder was going after conservative groups, when the IRS was denying Tea Party organizations their nonprofit status. So don't talk to me about how the mechanisms of government have never been used to prosecute political enemies. And I'm not making the argument that it should be tit for tat, but there should be a qualitative distinction. The things that the Trump administration is doing now, what we talked about earlier, about defunding, prosecuting, dismantling organizations that are actually engaged in real crime. Okay? It is a crime to organize for the purpose of committing criminal conduct. That is categorically different than, I don't like this guy, so I'm going to find out some way to conjure a crime to accuse him with for the purpose of being able to ask a question like this. And it didn't. The other thing I would say in response to this ain't working out for you very well. Because they did that. They followed that tact of let's smear, let's lie, let's accuse, let's falsely convict, and then run on that. And look what happened. Not really a winning strategy. It looks like we got another one.
I have a couple random comments, but the lady running for governor in California, in her interview, she stopped the interview because, I don't want this to get mean. And liberals, I'm just going to say communists, don't want to debate us, and that's why I'm not surprised that, like at a Charlie Kirk University event, there are no liberals here. They don't want to debate us. In Egan, they stand on the sidewalk with signs that say, resist, fascist. I mean, why do you want to be a fascist, Walter? It's like, why did you stop beating your wife? There are those kinds of questions like, well, who said I was a fascist? That's not even the definition of a fascist. But when you're talking about what legitimately taxes should fund, I learned recently about Cloward Piven, and that Frances Piven and her husband Cloward, I can't remember his first name, they designed a strategy to bankrupt America. And when I talk to my liberal nephew, he can talk about all kinds of, Jessica Tarlov is perfect, and they just love Tim Walz. And when I ask them about Cloward Piven, all of a sudden they become stupid. I mean, it's like, well, can't you Google it? Can't you tell me what, the strategy is to bankrupt America? And the lady talking about treason, is to destroy our country. And they won't talk about it. And it is a real thing. And I guess mostly what my point is in bringing that up is these people do want to destroy America. I mean, there is no middle ground. I mean, if you try to have a conversation with them, you're a fascist.
Yeah, so that raises a very essential point, because the temptation in responding to your observations is to paint with a very broad brush. I mean, we use these terms us and them and words like they when we're talking about the other side. The fact of the matter is, as I pointed out earlier, it's not all of the Democrats. It's the controlling interest in the Democrat Party. Somebody brought up A Precarious State earlier, the documentary that just released. Did you notice one of the people that they had in there? Gene Pawlowski. You know who Gene Pawlowski is? Recently retired Democrat House colleague of mine. All right. Now, he voted terribly, all right? He took terrible votes on things that are detrimental to the state. But if you listen to him, and these weren't the first comments he made about the precarious direction that our state is heading. He was, right after he retired, he was interviewed, I forget where it was, and he said something to the effect of what Minnesota needs is an unsession, meaning instead of writing a bunch of new laws, we need to comb through the books and repeal a bunch of the laws. That's a hell of a thing for a Democrat to say. He had to retire before he could say it, right? He had to retire before he could say it, because saying that as somebody who seeks office on the Democrat side of the ticket makes you persona non grata. You're out. And that's the way it operates over there. The controlling interest in their party is this radical stuff. It's the DSA stuff. Another thing that documentary pointed out, looking at the City Council of Minneapolis, you look at the voting records of the DSA-endorsed members and compare and contrast them against the mainstream Democrats on the City Council. It's like a 90% overlap in terms of how they vote. So increasingly, there's no distinction between the most radical wing of their party and the mainstream of their party. And that's the place that we're operating in. So, and I'll make one more point, going back to what you first brought up, which is this gal in California who's running for governor and the video that came out of her completely breaking down in an interview. You know what the question was? The best part of that story is what the question was, okay? The question was, what are you going to do? What are you going to say to the 40% of Californians who voted for Donald Trump in order to win them over? I don't understand the question. I don't need their vote. That's what she said. I don't need their vote. Whew. That's audacious. That is some cocky stuff right there. I don't need your vote. That's her message to the Trump voters in California. All right, well, pretty sure you're not going to get it, right? But what that signals is a complete, they really do believe, some of them, and again, I'm using the word they, I'm talking about this controlling interest within the Democrat Party. They believe what they say. They sincerely believe that we're fascists. They sincerely believe that we're terrible people that want to do the country harm and that want to harm underserved communities and all this stuff. And because they've assigned us that moral character, they've determined that we're not worth engaging with at all. We are to be hated. We are to be despised. We're deplorables, right? Where'd that one come from? Didn't come from some random person on the street with a sign. It came from the Democrat candidate for president of the United States in 2016. Basket of deplorables, right? That's where they're at. So that raises the question, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? And this is the point that since Charlie Kirk, and after reflecting upon it a little bit, I've come to the conclusion that it is not enough for us, and I'm using us again, and I don't just mean Republicans, I mean those of us who believe in the American project and want to see it fulfilled and move forward and bequeath to our children. It's not enough to just defeat them. Now, they do need to be defeated in the near term. They need to be decimated electorally in 2026. But what happens the day after, and the cycle after, and the decade after? What needs to happen is there needs to be a ministry to those who are in that party, whether they're voting for them or they're elected officials, party leaders. We need to figure out a way to tip the scales to where the Gene Pulowskis no longer feel like they need to retire before they can say something that makes sense. You know, we talk about how suppressed we feel. We just talked about all the stuff that the Biden and Obama administrations did to suppress conservative speech during their administrations. Imagine how it feels to be somebody who's semi-sane in the Democrat Party. You can't speak up. You can't dissent. You can't break ranks. It's an inquisition every single day. You better watch what you say. You better watch what you do, because we will throw you under the bus the second you step out of line. That is unsustainable, and they need to be rescued from it.
Well, and that's how we're going to rescue Minnesota. We are going to continue these conversations and outreach. It reminds me of what Rep. Hudson was just saying, reminds me of a phrase. Why are you raising your voice when you should be reinforcing your argument? So you could take out raising your voice and insert calling names. Why are you calling us names when you should be reinforcing your argument? And I have experienced many, as I'm sure many of you have, whether it be those in your spheres, friends, family, neighbors, etc. When you disagree, unfortunately, it can resort to name calling. And that's not how hearts and minds are going to be influenced. But in order to save Minnesota and save this country, we need to be having these conversations. We need to do so in a calm, respectful manner to demonstrate that there are rational arguments for how we get to the conclusions that lead to individual empowerment and long-term prosperity for oneself and one's children. That's the only way. Otherwise, if we continue to have these two camps that all they do is call names without reinforcing an argument, it's not going to persuade, again, hearts and minds. And that's why I am so appreciative of this format. I very much appreciate and enjoy conversations with people that I don't agree with, because there are perspectives that I can learn, and hopefully there are perspectives that others can learn. And then again, we can influence towards a greater, more prosperous Minnesota. Because the trajectory that we're on, anyone can see all the different metrics, whether it be education, healthcare, property taxes, and many of these other things that we've discussed. We're on a downward trajectory. It's not healthy. It's not leading to prosperity. So I was going to have concluding remarks, but I see one more individual at the microphone. So please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to weave a few of the topics discussed today into my questions. So, talked about fraud, disorder, communities, RICO. To what extent does the refusal to assimilate within certain communities contribute to the ongoing disorder? And would you apply the RICO statutes to the communities that have been involved in the fraud?
So, taking those in turn, I detect two questions there. To what extent does the failure to assimilate impact the disorder? Well, pretty aggressively, right? Because what is it that we're asking people to assimilate to? We're not asking that you come here and become a completely different person, that you give up your religion, that you give up your personal convictions, your culture, your cuisine, right? The things that mark you as a distinct ethnic group or people group. What we are asking, and it's a pretty minimal ask, you have to leave us alone. You have to respect our liberty. You have to obey our laws. You have to agree to the constitutional structure of our government. And you have to abide by everything that implies. And it would also be really nice if you liked that, if you appreciated it, if you were grateful, if you actually wanted to be an American before we let you be one, right? I think that's a pretty minimal ask. And yet, that's a controversial take. It's an extremely controversial take, that you should, when you come to America, you should actually want to be an American. For some reason, that rubs people the wrong way. But it absolutely positively should be the minimal expectation of folks who we bring in to our communities from outside. To the second part applying RICO to an entire community group, I don't think is feasible. And I also don't think it's fair because, as I said prior, it's not everybody, it's not the ethnic tie or the community tie that is the underlying structure of the criminal enterprise. It's particular organizations, whether formal or informal. So you've got these, for instance, talking about the fraud, you got 12 people in one building, 12 organizations in one building, all defrauding the state. Okay, who are all those people? What are their relationships? Who taught them how to do that? All right? Like if I asked you right now, go start a business today and you can't look up how to do it, just go. Would you be able to? Some of you might, because you've probably done it before. But for most people, they would have to have some sort of guidance or assistance. Who guided and assisted people who don't even know what our laws are to navigate the process to set up these businesses, right? So it's tracking all of that and holding that informal organization accountable with things like RICO. But I think it's important to be narrow in terms of our application, but not so narrow that we allow people to slip through the cracks, which we absolutely are. Joe Thompson said that he could keep 1,000 prosecutors busy. He's only got 5 working on fraud. And he said that we're not going to be able to prosecute our way out of this, which is another way of saying injustice shall stand. There are hundreds of people, if not thousands, who are going to get away with what they've done to the state. That's unacceptable. So with that said, thanks for coming out today, guys. We appreciate it. And the patience to endure the conversation. Hopefully you found it enjoyable and informative, and we answered the questions that you had for us. And maybe we'll do it again sometime.
And I similarly thank you for coming out. Everybody online, thank you for watching. Thank you to St. Michael's Cinema, Representative Hudson, myself, Senator Eric Lucero. Again, I hope this is one of many as we continue to have dialogue across this community, across the state. Again, later today we're going to be headed up to Brainerd for a similar venue. And we look forward to the conversations with people that disagree, because we may not agree, but the objective is to find clarity, in the great words of Dennis Prager. Clarity, not agreement, is the objective. And so thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful Saturday and rest of the weekend.